Important things to remember when it comes to novation, no? Again, novation is the substitution or change of an obligation by another, resulting in the extinguishment or modification of the old obligation. Either by, number one, changing its object or principal conditions. You can remember my example yung sa Dune, no? Na libro, replacing the obligation to deliver a copy of The Fault in Our Stars. You can still remember that, I hope. Or, no, the other two modes, we call those personal novation. So number two, substituting another in the place of the debtor. Or number three, subrogating a third person in the creditor's rights. What are the requisites of novation? Of course, there has to be a previous valid obligation. There has to be an agreement of the parties to modify or extinguish the old obligation. You just have to take note, no? Novation is not, it is never presumed. The parties must clearly and unmistakably agree to the novation. Next, no, there has to be an extinguishment or at least a modification of the old obligation. And finally, the new obligation must be valid itself. Now, when we talk about novation, we have to consider this little something that we call the test of incompatibility. The test of incompatibility, it asks us whether the old and new obligations can stand together. If totally incompatible yung old obligation at yung new obligation, then there is novation. But if the obligations, the old and the new one, if they can stand together, then there is no novation because there is no incompatibility. For example, no, we have X and we have Y. X agreed to deliver to Y a black Honda HR-V on December 3. Later, a second agreement was entered into whereby X would deliver to Y an orange Ford Fiesta also on December 3. Is there novation? No, because the parties did not expressly declare in their second agreement that the two obligations are incompatible. Besides, no, the two agreements can stand separately. Pero pwede naman na ang intention ng parties is to deliver 2 cars, no, on December 3. Hindi naman nakalagay na upon the delivery of this new obligation to deliver an orange Ford Fiesta would result, no, in the change of the prior obligation to deliver a black Honda HR-V. Wala namang nakalagay na ganun. Wala namang sinabi na ganun. And therefore, we should consider that the two obligations, the old and the new one, are not really incompatible at all. Therefore, there is no novation. There is simply a new contract in addition to the old. Now, what if it is this one? A and B. A is obliged to construct a house on a parcel of land owned by B. Subsequently, A agreed to construct a commercial building on the same parcel of land, no? Also at the behest of B. So the area of the land is such na hindi pa pwedeng magkasya pareho. It's either the house should be constructed or it is the commercial building that must be erected. Is there novation? Yes, because even in the absence of an express agreement between A and B, the two obligations are absolutely incompatible with each other. Hindi mo sila pwedeng ipatayo nang magkatabi or magkasama. There's only so much space. So much so that you either build the house or you build the commercial building. There is no either or, you have to choose one. And considering the stark difference between a residential unit, a residential building or house, and a commercial building, hindi sila talaga compatible. There is total incompatibility and therefore there is novation. The old obligation to construct a house is considered extinguished and in its place is the new obligation to construct a commercial building. Now, what are the effects of novation? As a general rule, the extinguishment of the principal obligation carries as well the extinguishment of the accessory. So if there are any accessory obligations attached to the principal, then we follow the principle of accessory follows the principal. So kung merong principal obligations attached to the old one, If the old obligation is novated, then you also say bye-bye to any accessory contracts. Except, no, where any of these situations apply. There is contrary stipulation. If there is a stipulation in favor of a third party who is not a party to the contract, yung tinatawag natin stipulation poa atwa, unless the beneficiary consents to the novation. Next, of course, if the novation is modificatory only, it does not result in the total extinguishment of the obligation. Or finally, if the old obligation is void, therefore there is nothing to novate, as in fact there is no old obligation to speak of. Now, the old obligation subsists if the new obligation is void. Okay? If the obligation supposed to replace the old obligation is actually null and void, then the old obligation will still subsist. Or if the new obligation is voidable but already annulled. When we talk about defective contracts tomorrow, makikita ninyo kung ano yung pinag-iba ng void at ng voidable. At this juncture, parang iisipin niyo, ha? Yung pinag-iba ba yan maliban sa spelling? Parang annulment at saka declaration of nullity sa kasal. Actually, may pinag-iba po yan. Hindi yan pareho. And you will understand tomorrow once we reach that topic. Of course, no, if there is a contrary intention or stipulation on the part of the parties na talagang at any cost, even if the new obligation is void, that the old obligation will no longer subsist, then we have to follow the intention of the parties. Now, when it comes to a condition, kasi di ba obligations can either be pure or conditional. I hope you still remember your pure and conditional obligations. If the old obligation had a condition attached to it, again, a condition, no, can be resolutory or suspensive. If the condition is resolutory and the condition occurred, it happened, then the old obligation is already extinguished. Ano ulit ang resolutory condition? It is a future and uncertain event, the happening of which will extinguish the obligation. Okay? So kung naganap na yung resolutory condition, then the old obligation has already been extinguished. And therefore, as a result, there can be no novation, even if there is a new obligation, because there is nothing to novate. Okay? Now, if the condition is suspensive, what is a suspensive condition? A future and uncertain event, the happening of which will cause the obligation to arise. Okay? If the condition is suspensive and it never occurred, then there is as if no old obligation. And as a result, nothing also to novate. What if the original obligation was subject to a condition, but the new obligation is pure? As a general rule, the pure obligation, the new one, will become conditional, subject to the same conditions as the old, except if there is any stipulation or agreement to the contrary. This is under Article 1299 of the New Civil Code. So ngayon, no, we go to the kinds of personal, no, kinds of personal novation. So kagaya nung kanina, di ba? Substitution and subrogation. So a third person can be substituted in place of the old debtor, and that will be considered as a novation. So there are two kinds of substitution. Meron tayong tinatawag na expromission, meron tayong tinatawag na delegation. So by expromission, we refer to where a new debtor, expromission rather, happens or is effected with the consent of the creditor. So alam ng creditor na mayroong ipapalit na bagong debtor. Expromission is initiated at the instance of the new debtor, even without the consent or even against the will of the old debtor. So in expromission, ang talagang parties lang na mayroong active role, yung new debtor, a third person who wants to become the debtor. And then, of course, the creditor who consents to this new arrangement. Expromission can occur even against the will of the old debtor. So wala siyang say, walang say si old debtor. Pag sinabi ni third person, ako na ang bagong debtor. If the creditor consents, then there is expromission. Whatever the opinion of the old debtor is, it doesn't matter. So what are the requisites of expromission? First, of course, the initiative for substitution, which must emanate from the new debtor. And secondly, the creditor must consent to the substitution. Now, as for delegation is effected with the consent of the creditor. Unlike expromission, delegation is initiated by the old debtor this time, with the concurrence of the new debtor. So dito sa delegation, there are three active participants. The old debtor who initiates the delegation, so ang tawag sa kanya delegante. Now, the delegation must be concurred to by the new debtor. So merong agreement, no? Explicit agreement on the part of the new debtor, which we call delegado, and ultimately with the consent of the creditor. So everybody consents, no? The creditor here is called delegatario. Yan. So the old debtor initiates, the new debtor and the creditor both consent. They both agree. So what are the requisites? Sabi ni debtor, itong si Kolokoy na to, siya na ang bagong debtor. Sabi nung bagong debtor, opo, ako nga po ang bagong debtor. Tapos sabi naman ni creditor, okay, gano'n na nga. So ibig sabihin sa kanya na ako maniningil. So everybody consents. So what are the requisites? The initiative, of course, for substitution must come from the old debtor. Next, there must be consent of the new debtor. And finally, there is acceptance by the creditor. What would be the effect, if any, if the new debtor turns out to be insolvent? Magkaiba yan. Depende if we talk about expromission or if we talk about delegation. In expromission, the new debtor's insolvency or non-fulfillment shall not revive the original debtor's liability to the creditor, whether the substitution is effected with or without the knowledge or against the will of the original debtor. Na-lock-in na, pumasok na si new debtor sa eksena, na itsyapwera na si old debtor. In expromission, if it turns out na wala naman palang kakayahan magbayad si new debtor, outside of the contract, outside of the obligation na si old debtor, hindi na siya pwedeng i-hold liable no matter what. Wala nang balikan. Okay? Kasi in the first place, expromission is initiated. Expromission happens even if without the knowledge or against the will of the original debtor. Hindi naman tama na bigla siyang hihilahin pabalik dun sa obligation simply because the new debtor cannot pay or is insolvent. Now, when it comes to delegation, the creditor can sue the old debtor only when, number one, the insolvency was prior to the delegation and publicly known. So alam ng lahat na itong new debtor na planong ipasok, wala naman talagang kakayanan magbayad. Or, if the old debtor knew of such insolvency at the time he delegated the obligation. So, while hindi publicly known, alam pala ni old debtor all along na walang kakayanan magbayad itong si new debtor. In which case, considering that it is the old debtor who initiates delegation, the creditor can pursue him or her. Again, itong dalawang situation na to, itong dalawang scenario na to, it boils down to this, that the insolvency was known. Okay? Now, we must distinguish between these two. Payment by a third person, yung example ko kanina, and yung change of debtor. No? In payment by a third person, the debtor is not necessarily released from the debt. Kasi di ba, payment by a third person without the knowledge of the debtor obliges the debtor to reimburse the third person. Naalala nyo pa kanina, di ba? To such an extent that the debtor was benefited by that payment. When it comes to change of debtor, whether expromission or delegation, as a general rule, the debtor is released from the obligation. In payment by a third person, it can be done even without the consent of the creditor. No? Magugulat na lang si creditor na, mayroong nagbabayad sa akin. No? Of course, it is dependent on whether or not he will accept payment In which case, i-apply natin yung tender of payment and consignation. Diba? But as a rule, walang matinong creditor na magre-refuse, hindi ba? If a third person shows up and then manifests intent to pay. Now, of course, when it comes to change of debtor, whether it is expromission or delegation, there has to be consent of the creditor, no matter what. No? Diba? In payment by a third person, we only take into account one obligation. In change of debtor, whether it is expromission or it is delegation, there are two obligations. One, the old obligation which is extinguished, and another one, the novated one, no? The one that is newly created. Finally, in payment by a third person, the third person has no obligation to pay, no? If the debtor is insolvent. Okay? Kasi normally, the third person pays regardless of the nature of the capability rather of the debtor to pay the obligation. And finally, when it comes to change of debtor, the new debtor is of course obliged to pay. Kasi nga the debtor is already subsumed, no, into the rights of the debtor. Siya na yung bagong debtor ngayon. I am the new debtor now. Previously, a third person non-party, it's either when it comes to expromission, it is the new debtor which initiates, siya yung nagpipresenta, ako magbabayad. Or when it comes to delegation, it is the old debtor who points to this new debtor, siya na magbabayad. And this new debtor is of course by all means obliged to pay the debt. Now we go to subrogation, no, to the rights of the creditor. It has two kinds, no? Either conventional or legal. By conventional subrogation, we mean a subrogation that takes place by the agreement of the parties, kaya conventional or voluntary, no? Conventional subrogation requires the intervention and consent of three persons: the original creditor or the old creditor, the new creditor, and the debtor. Para siyang delegasyon, no? The three parties, the three persons, they must all agree. Si old creditor, si new creditor, at si debtor. Lahat sila dapat nakalock in. Yes, we agree to this subrogation. Now, the other kind is legal subrogation, which takes place without agreement, but by operation of law because of certain acts. These acts, no? Ito. Number one, if the creditor pays another creditor who is preferred without the debtor's knowledge. No? For example, unsecured creditor. So, yung debt or yung obligation is not secured by a pledge or a mortgage. And a secured creditor, yung merong mortgage na collateral, ganyan, dun sa pagkakautang, they share a common debtor. Now, no, itong si unsecured creditor pays the common debtor's debt to the secured creditor. So sabi ni unsecured creditor, alam ko may pagkakautang itong si common debtor natin sa'yo. Bayaran ko na ngayon. Now, the unsecured creditor will be subrogated to the rights of the secured creditor vis-a-vis their common debtor. So, pwede nang singilin siya ngayon ni unsecured debtor, no? Pwede niya singilin si common debtor para dun sa utang ni common debtor kay secured creditor. That is how subrogation works anyway. The other situation is when a third person not interested in the obligation pays the debt with the express or tacit approval of the debtor. Okay? So ngayon, itong si third person, technically, he now gains the rights of the creditor. Kung gusto niya, pwede niyang habulin si debtor. Okay? But of course, in practice, the third person does not pursue the debtor. No? But in theory, as far as the law is concerned, if he wants to, he can do that. Now, finally, even without the debtor's knowledge, a person interested in the fulfillment of the obligation, for example, guarantor. Now, for context, no, a guarantor is someone who secures the fulfillment of the obligation. In what way? Kapag yung debtor hindi kayang magbayad or ayaw magbayad, ang pwedeng singilin ni creditor ay si guarantor. O in other words, ito yung tinatawag na mga co-maker kapag nangungutang. Kapag ang mga magulang nyo ay nagtatrabaho sa gobyerno, alam nila yan. Hindi sila pwede makapag-loan nang wala silang co-maker or guarantor. Okay? Now, a person interested in the fulfillment of the obligation like a guarantor pays without prejudice as to the effects of confusion as to the latter share. Ibig sabihin nito, kapag si guarantor ang siningil ni creditor, kasi nga hindi kaya magbayad ni debtor, wala siguro siyang funds na sapat at the time the obligation fell due. So si guarantor yung nagbayad. The guarantor will now be subrogated to the rights of the creditor. So ngayon, bayad na si creditor eh. Ngayon, si guarantor, pwede niyang habulin si debtor para i-reimburse kung ano yung kanyang binayad. Okay? So that is it. Yan yung tatlong situations where legal subrogation is presumed. Now, let us distinguish between conventional subrogation and assignment of rights. Assignment of rights premised on the idea that rights as a general rule are transmissible from one person to another. Conventional subrogation and assignment of rights are governed by completely different provisions of the Civil Code. In conventional subrogation, considering nga na conventional by mutual agreement, of course, the debtor's consent is required. In assignment of rights, the debtor's consent is not required. Okay? Kasi it is a transaction or an agreement between the creditor and a third person. Now, the third person will then gain the rights of the creditor. Now, in conventional subrogation, it extinguishes the old obligation and gives right to a new one. It is a kind of novation. In assignment of rights, it does not modify or extinguish the obligation. Nag-iiba lang ng creditor. In conventional subrogation, the defects and vices in the old obligation are cured because the old obligation is extinguished and replaced with a new one. In assignment of rights, if there are any defects and vices in the old obligation, they are not cured because there is no replacement or novation of the obligation here. It is the same old obligation. In conventional subrogation, this takes effect upon the moment of novation or subrogation. In assignment of rights, walang novation, and therefore, it will take effect upon notification. As far as the debtor is concerned, the debtor has to be notified. Kasi if the debtor is not notified, then the debtor can still pay the old creditor. Okay? Now, that class says, wraps up the law on obligations. Let us have a 5-minute break. We resume 8:30. I will be back. 5 minutes.